All right, we're going to dive into a theory that takes one of history's most debated prophecies and, well, it flips it completely on its head. It argues that its fulfillment wasn't a single event, but a violent 74-year saga that we might have been misunderstanding this whole time.
So let's start with one big question. What if the story we all think we know about the fall of Jerusalem is just radically incomplete? What if the real key events actually happened decades after the history books told us that chapter was closed?
So here's the heart of the argument. On one side, you've got the common view, right? It compresses all the major prophetic fulfillments into one single brutal year, 70 AD. But this new theory, called the Atavist synthesis, argues for a much, much longer view, a 74-year sequence of interconnected wars and rebellions.
So, we're going to walk through the framework of this 74-year theory. We're going to look at how it resequences events and uses historical data to argue that the true climax happened long after most people think the story was already over.
To really get this, we first need to understand the theory's core blueprint. And it's actually based on a pretty simple architectural metaphor, the difference between joints and compartments.
Okay, so first you've got the joints. Think of these like the structural beams of the prophecy, and they're taken from the Old Testament. They give you the sequence, what happens first, what happens next, but they don't tell you how long each phase is going to last. It's basically the blueprint without a schedule.
Then you have the compartments. These are the historical events, the stuff described in the New Testament and other sources from the time. They fill in that blueprint, giving it a timeline and real-world dimensions. They're the ones that answer the how long and in what way questions that the joints alone just can't.
So the key is this three-step method. You start with that Old Testament structure, you overlay it with the New Testament's timeline, and then, and this is crucial, you fill in the often overlooked details from non-biblical historians like Josephus and Tacitus.
All right, so let's actually apply this blueprint to the first part of the timeline, the period that covers that famous First Jewish-Roman War.
According to this synthesis, the clock actually starts in 62 AD, with all these supernatural signs that map to the opening of the seals in Revelation. Then in 67 AD, a war in heaven is witnessed. Fast forward to 70 AD, Jerusalem falls, which is interpreted here as the judgment of the great harlot. But see, it doesn't end there. The final defeat of the Zealot movement, which this theory identifies as the beast, that doesn't happen until the fall of Masada in 73 AD.
Now, what's just remarkable is that event from 67 AD. It was recorded not just by the Jewish historian Josephus, but also by the Roman historian Tacitus. I mean, he describes this vision of armies fighting in the sky and a voice declaring, "The gods were leaving." That's two totally independent sources, one Jewish and one Roman, describing the exact same bizarre event.
And right here is where the conventional story just ends. By 73 AD, Masada has fallen, the war is considered over. The rebellion is utterly crushed. But according to this theory, this wasn't the end. It wasn't even close. This was barely the halfway point.
Because what happened next is the most staggering part of this whole argument. These massive, almost forgotten wars that erupted decades after everyone thought the conflict was completely finished.
Just take a look at this. In 66 AD, at the start of the First War, Jewish forces won this stunning victory at Beth Horon, killing about 5,600 Romans. It was a huge deal. But then 45 years after Jerusalem was destroyed, the Kiddos War breaks out, and it results in an estimated 450,000 Roman and Greek casualties. No, that is not a typo. 450,000.
And this just brilliantly illustrates the central puzzle. How? How does a people whose political and religious center was completely annihilated, whose population was decimated, how do they somehow mount a coordinated military campaign decades later that inflicts nearly 80 times more casualties than their most famous early victory? It doesn't seem possible.
This brings us to the final, absolutely apocalyptic act of this 74-year timeline, the Bar Kokhba revolt, which this theory identifies as the historical fulfillment of that famous Gog and Magog prophecy.
The leader of this revolt, a man named Simon Bar Kokhba, fielded a standing army of 400,000 soldiers. Now, to put that into perspective, that is an enormous military force for any ancient power, let alone one that was supposedly crushed just 60 years earlier. So the Atavist synthesis draws these direct parallels. A great deceiver appears. You have the esteemed Rabbi Akiva proclaiming Bar Kokhba as the Messiah. Armies are gathered like sand. There's the 400,000-man force. The prophecy talks about an attack on the saints, and history records Bar Kokhba persecuting Christians who refused to join his revolt.
Finally, the prophecy calls for a kind of divine intervention, and historically, Rome had to deploy a staggering 12 legions to finally put down the rebellion.
And the success of this revolt was, well, it was unprecedented. Bar Kokhba's forces completely destroyed 5 entire Roman legions. Now, to put that in context, Rome famously lost 3 legions in the Teutoburg Forest, a defeat that haunted them for centuries. Bar Kokhba destroyed 5.
So how does this all resolve? I mean, how can a prophecy about this generation stretch over 74 years? Well, the theory finds its anchor in the life of one single pivotal figure.
Rabbi Akiva. He was born around 15 AD. He lived through the ministry of Jesus. He saw the destruction of the temple. He was there for the Ketos War, and he was the one who proclaimed Bar Kokhba as the Messiah. He was finally executed in 135 AD at the age of 120. The argument here is that this generation had not fully passed away until key figures like Akiva, who witnessed the beginning, also witnessed the very end.
So, let's put it all together. The theory presents the 74-year prophetic timeline. It argues that 70 AD was a crucial midpoint, not the final act. It elevates the Ketos and Bar Kokhba wars from historical footnotes to climactic, central events, and it redefines this generation, not as some strict 40-year window, but as the actual lifespan of the people who lived through it all. And ultimately, by expanding the frame from a compressed single year to a synthesized full generation, the entire narrative just transforms. Events that seemed totally disconnected and, frankly, inexplicable suddenly fall into a coherent, if pretty shocking, sequence.
And you know, that leaves us with one last thought. What other parts of history might we be misreading simply because our frame of reference is too narrow? What other stories might change completely if we just adjust the timeline?